Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure, it's a real honor to actually be back at the Warsaw Security Forum and indeed to talk about an absolutely incredibly important dimension, i.e. democracy and our democratic resilience. So, of course, this is something that, this is a conversation that we could take in all sorts of different directions. And I think here on stage, we have indeed represented different dimensions of this challenge. Please join me first in welcoming here with us Commissioner Michael McGrath, European Commissioner for Democracy, Justice and the Rule of Law and Consumer Protection. We have Kevin Casas-Zamora, Secretary General of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Pascal Lamy, Director General of the World Trade Organization up until 2013 and Commissioner for Trade in the European Commission up until 2004. And Royal Hansen, Vice President, Engineering at Google. So as I said, this is really a conversation that we could take in all sorts of directions. So let me perhaps give it a little bit of framing, particularly if we're talking about democratic resilience here in Europe. It is quite clear that, as we know, Russia is pursuing a strategy at reconstituting empire. And that strategy really has, I would say, three major dimensions to it. There's the military component that, of course, begins with, but as we've already seen, doesn't end with Ukraine. And I would say that that dimension of the strategy is actually the least successful. There is then the hybrid element to all of this, from cyber attacks to sabotages to attacks on critical infrastructure. And on this, let's say we're gradually doing a little bit better in terms of understanding what we should be doing about it. And then there's a third component, which is really a broader, I would say, political component. And that's really a component which is aimed at weakening, at fragmenting our democracies. And this is really where I think this conversation about democratic resilience in Europe fits in. Now, of course, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to suggest here that this is only and exclusively orchestrated by Russia. It is quite clear that if there weren't some domestic reasons, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But I highlight this because I think it's important to bear in mind that there is a democracy security nexus, which is particularly relevant when we are talking about Europe. And as we think about what we could or should be doing about it, let me begin with you, Commissioner McGrath. So once upon a time, when we were thinking about the European Union, well, once upon a time, I would say we used to think of democracy as being a destination. And it was a destination that once we kind of got to the Holy Land, there was no going back because, of course, it was the best possible system, right? And so who would be so stupid as to go backwards? I think we've now understood and learned that democracy is a journey, and it can go forwards and it can go backwards. And of course, we know that there has been some quite significant backsliding within Europe. Now, of course, the European Commission doesn't have the magic wand on this, and we shouldn't expect it to, but there are a number of instruments that the Commission is developing in order to ensure rule of law and democracy within the EU. So give us perhaps your bit of the recipe as to how we should go about this.
Well, thank you very much, Nathalie, and good afternoon, everyone. I think you set the scene there very well, and it is indisputably the case that democracy is a journey. It is always a work in progress. It is always something that must be nurtured and invested in, and we always have to be aware of what are the threats and the risks facing it. And we start from agreeing on the objective, which is to ensure that we have free and democratic elections within the European Union, that the citizens of Europe get to decide freely and exercise their sovereign right to decide who they elect and who governs them in their local authorities, regional national government and indeed in the European Parliament. And the context has changed, and the threats are becoming more apparent and are becoming, I think, more acute and certainly more complex. And that is why, recognising that, President von der Leyen has brought forward the project of a European Democracy Shield. And she has asked me as Commissioner to lead on that work. And so in November, we plan to, as a college, adopt a European Democracy Shield, most likely in the form of a Commission communication. We will then set about its implementation. And it will deal with a number of key elements, including FIMI, the Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference and Disinformation. The President announced a new European Democratic Resilience Centre, which will build on a lot of the good work that is happening at member state level, but seek to achieve better coordination so that we can support each other in the journey. But fundamentally, it is the people's democracy, and that is why investing in our people and giving them the tools that they need to navigate an increasingly complex information environment. So investment in digital literacy, media literacy, fact-checking, supporting local democracy initiatives. I think people feel most connected to their elected representatives in their local community. That's how I started in politics 25 years ago. But also recognising that there is more we can do to share best practice and information about the conduct of elections. And then how can we engage young people? They are the future. It is their democracy. They have most at stake when we discuss these issues. How can we get them more involved and more connected in the democratic process? So all of that work is hugely important, and I look forward to presenting the Shield to the College in November. Alongside all of that, we have complementary work to do with rule of law, because if rule of law is undermined, then our democracy is undermined. They are both vital pillars of the European Union, and of course we face ongoing challenges. We're developing a stronger toolbox, including in the context of the next EU budget, where we want to build that closer link between access to EU funds and respect for the rule of law and respect for the Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Well, actually, on that last point, could I just kind of press you a little bit further? And I appreciate that we're only really at the beginning of the conversations on the next MFF. But, I mean, on this idea of, if I can put it in the simplest possible way, sort of mainstreaming political conditionality across EU financial instruments, what is the reception that you're receiving to that move, in a sense?
I think there is a lot of support. I think the vast majority of member states and MEPs recognise that rule of law isn't an optional extra. It is a core binding obligation of European Union membership, and it is in our treaty, Article 2. It's also enshrined in our legislation and the conditionality regulation, and it has been interpreted many times by the Court of Justice. So this is inherent in EU membership, and if the rule of law begins to break down, then all of the other things that we're seeking to achieve in the European Union, including economic growth and competitiveness, will not happen if we do not have trust and confidence in the legal system. Consumers lose trust, investors lose confidence, business sentiment suffers. So as an economic issue, even alongside fundamental rights and values, it is crucial that we do invest in rule of law. So we will continue to have the conditionality regulation that will remain in place on a permanent basis, and that captures all EU funds and is designed to protect the financial interests of the European Union. But we recognise we need a more flexible and adaptable tool, and that is why in these national and regional partnership plans we will build in now by design rule of law conditionality and respect for the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So we will be able to turn off the tap of funding, we will be able to reallocate it, while at the same time trying to protect the end beneficiaries. So this is a proposal by the Commission. It will be part of a very complex and protracted set of negotiations around the MFF, but we do believe that at this moment in our history, we have to stand behind the rule of law in the European Union.
Thank you very much. And Secretary General Casas-Zamora, let me turn to you. So your organisation focuses very much on electoral assistance. And we know indeed that election meddling is a prime dimension in this entire affair. And I guess my question to you is, you know, electoral assistance has always been obviously an important thing. But once upon a time, when we lived in the wonderful liberal international order, this was really a prime element of our support for democratization. And of course, we still like to believe that this is the case, but in a sense, alongside this, which is obviously still an ambition, we have electoral assistance that has to play a far more defensive role, right? So this is what we have to do in order to prevent election meddling. So I'm just wondering if you could give us a sense of how this particular key dimension of democratic resilience, how it has shifted as we have shifted from, in a sense, peace to wartime, right? And as we have made that shift, how to at the same time not to abandon the ambition for that more proactive and not simply defensive role.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. And I want to thank the organizers, the Kazimierz Polański Foundation, great colleagues. Thank you for the invitation. Look, this is very true, what you're saying. I guess the fundamental part of the shift is that we are working, in our case, very closely with electoral commissions in many countries all over the world, certainly in Europe, and certainly in the Eastern neighborhood, around questions of risk management, because the risks around electoral integrity have increased by an order of magnitude. I mean, some of them have to do with cybersecurity, some of them have to do with deliberate disinformation campaigns polluting the democratic debates, and some of it has to do with the flow of money into politics in a number of countries. So we are trying to help electoral commissions to up their game. And I guess this speaks to a broader point about democracy. This is not simply about elections. If we care about the future of democracy, we are indeed forced in the current environment to play defense, to protect in a very active way some of the foundational elements of democracy, like electoral integrity, without which nothing else matters, to protect judicial independence, to protect institutions that manifest the rule of law. But at the same time, this is not enough. I mean, we need to play offense in other aspects. I mean, and fundamentally, and this speaks to a point that you raised in your introduction, which I deeply share, we have to make sure that we address those issues that are making a lot of people fed up with democracy. Because ultimately, foreign malign interference preys on the weaknesses of democracies all over the world. And very often I feel that when we have these discussions, we focus a lot, rightly, on the external dimension, on the reality of external attacks, but we don't pay enough attention to internal decay as the fundamental driver of the challenges that democracy is facing around the world. And we would be well served to pay more attention to that.
Yeah, I totally share that. And in fact, let me pick that point and turn it to Pascal to, in a sense, reflect, I think, on these two sides of the coin that we're presenting here. And let's take, actually, the good news of the day, Moldova, as an example. I think what the election in Moldova is telling us is that, on the one hand, when you have policy that delivers, when you have a good story to tell, and when you have a principled and strong voice to tell it, actually, things can, good things can happen. But at the same time, the election in Moldova is also telling us that we haven't cracked the nut on election meddling and disinformation and all bad things, right? And these two things, in a sense, coexist. So, Pascal, I'm wondering if you could both reflect on the point that Kevin ended on, right? You know, what are the real elements of our democratic fragility that we should be working on and how to do it, as well as what are the elements which are, in a sense, more part of that defensive strategy, but how to address those elements that are more part of a defensive strategy while living up to our democratic standards, which I think is another element of the conundrum.
Well, that's a very large question. I'll try to answer it, Nathalie, in a very pragmatic way. Sort of what should we do and what are we doing with a number of civil society organizations at the EU level. First, I think there's no beating the bush. Democracy in Europe is under attack, both from outside and from inside. And my line of argument being, what should we do? I think the first thing we should do is recognize this reality. Recognize that there is a fight. This has to be seen and dealt with as a fight on many grounds. But I believe deeply that public perception that democracy is at stake in Europe is not where it should be. So we have first to explain better, to popularize better the necessity of this fight. Now, then, if we succeed in doing this, we have to organize ourselves. And this is what a number of civil society organizations or think tanks are doing. And I just want to share my experience with the Jacques Delors Institute and the Friends of Europe, which will be regrouped in a new foundation very soon, which is the formidable potential of citizen engagement. We are doing this on the ground. We are developing tools like, for instance, surveys in order to gather trustable in-time data about what people have in mind, then moving to techniques like focus group, for instance, where people discuss the issues that matter for them, not big conceptual issues, but everyday life problems. And this shows, the experience of that shows that a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of non-communication, a lot of prejudged ideas, which are part of the democratic debate, but need to be framed in a way that leads, and that's what democracy is for, to properly established collective preferences. That's something that works. And then if you do that, you start establishing mostly local communities upon which you can start building, for instance, civic learning in order to foster civic engagement, in particular in elections. So I'm insisting on this sort of very bottom-up way of addressing the problems we have. I think we can do much better. Our own ambition is to scale up what we do from the sort of 10,000 people in roughly 8 countries within the European Union to something which is to the 100,000 scale, but keeping this bottom-up experiment, for instance, in moving to a bit more sophisticated ways to proceed, which is, for instance, deliberative polling. That also bring a lot. And if I can make, and I'm happy we have a commissioner with us tonight, if I can make one proposal that the EU Commission should consider, which is to have a scale of tipping points. We have this for climate or for biodiversity. I think in Europe we need such an approach. Properly, that's complex to be done, but I think if you were able to provide a map with indicators of where things are getting worse, where things are not getting worse, including in locating tipping points, we know what that matters. Tipping points is what matters. The difference between democracy and illiberalism is what you can't go back. So this is something, I think, which you should be able to consider more.
Thank you. Royal, let me turn to you. So we have known for a long time just how important the connection between digital and democracy is. So this is not a new story. I would say, and I'll put it in a rather provocative way, I think, you know, whereas in the first wave of that story, where the development of digital technologies was really a lot about connecting peoples, that stage of development tilted towards technology supporting processes of democratization. Now that we are in a different stage, where rather than technology being only about connectivity, technology is and has a lot to do with data. That arguably is a stage of development which can and has, to an extent, been exploited far more successfully in order to tilt towards authoritarian systems of governance. So in a sense, whereas the role of tech companies like yours has always been important, in a sense, the onus and the responsibility is much greater now than it used to be because of that potential bias, in a sense, in terms of fueling a set of, I think, unrelated, you know, sort of related but not exactly the same phenomenon, from extremism to radicalization to polarization to misinformation and disinformation. So how do you, as private sector, how do you, as a tech company, understand where we are in that journey and the responsibility that companies like yours have?
Yeah, it's a great framing, and as I'm listening to this, it's a wonderful example of, I think, the first point, which is that we have a cross-functional responsibility. These are not, none of this work is done in isolation. So I'll just, you know, we learned, as you're sort of alluding to, over a decade ago that we had a very important role in elections. And in fact, now have a team that follows the globe, including sort of elections earlier this year in Poland, that works with electoral commissions, campaigns, and it takes on a variety of forms. For the first to what you're talking about, what we've learned, we track about 300 nation-state actors, including Russian threat actors, who we know are attempting to sow discord or other, you know, causing other trouble. We track over 1,000 organized crime groups, and the line blurs between those two. And so the first thing we do is we work on the infrastructure itself to make sure the integrity and legitimacy of the infrastructure which supports an election is sound, and people know that. Like, I think that, to your point, people have to know it. It's not enough just to do it. The second is we make sure it's available. We worked with the Polish Election Commission earlier this year, and the availability of information at any given time is vulnerable to denial of service attacks. And we saw a 500% increase in the attacks on the Polish infrastructure in the days in advance of the election. We had put protections in front of that, similar to what keeps search or other services up. And maybe the third point, which I think is most important that we collaborate on, is that the information related to elections, where to vote. I think the point about local is really important here, because these are not decisions, or we're never going to know everything about each election at a global level, and need partnerships across civil society and public sector so that we're making sure the right information is available. And so our goal is to be a part of the community, but just in support of integrity of the election process.
Yeah, and I can see that element which has to do, and then I'd like actually to come back to Kevin on this point, and how indeed there is this electoral assistance dimension to it. But perhaps before I do so, Royal, to though come back to this question. So there's a question of ensuring the integrity of elections, but we know that democracy is much more than elections. I mean, election is the first and perhaps even most important component, but it's not the only one. So in this question of polarization, disinformation, misinformation, extremism, radicalization, there is, I think, the space where I think even conceptually, at least I haven't got my head around what more companies such as yours could be doing.
And so we have a variety of programs, and you're right, this extends beyond just the role of elections. And I think the first thing that's important, and that we've learned through having the battle scars, is that we have to be very policy and principle driven, because these can't be seen to sort of waver with the either partisan or other whims of the moment. So we're very policy driven and have processes that people can rely on and follow. The second part of it is, and where it links to some of these other civil society roles, is we have a program called Trusted Flaggers, where we have an ongoing relationship with people who play that role in society to decide whether it trips a flag or to even the idea of thresholds, so that this can't be seen to delegitimize the platforms themselves, or it causes a second-order problem. So it's that combination of being principle-driven and having relationships within society that help call some of those disinformation questions.
Thank you. Kevin, let me turn back to you on the question, though, of elections specifically. Yep. And I remember 2-3 weeks ago, I was in Rome, and President Sandu was yep. in Rome. And of course, this was, 3 weeks before the elections in Moldova. And there was this fascinating conversation that I had with the group with the president in Rome, and basically what they were saying is, we know that something will happen, right, in terms of election meddling, but we don't quite know what will happen. So I'm just wondering how can prevention actually take place when at times we don't quite have a sense of where the attack is going to come from, how the attack is going to play out, when it's going to play out, in order to ensure the integrity of the electoral process?
Well, all we can do is try to do everything we can to minimize the risks. The risk will always be there. And I find the case of Moldova extraordinarily important and interesting for this discussion. Number one, because it shows a point that is often lost in these discussions, which is that we don't know really what the impact of, for example, disinformation campaigns can be on individual voting decisions. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Russia threw the sink at Moldova, and yet the result was not what they wanted. So we don't really know how this impacts individual voters. What we do know, to go back to your previous point, is that disinformation pollutes the democratic environment for discussion. And that disinformation feeds into polarization, and that polarization weakens the resistance of democracy and the ability of democracies to forge the broad-based agreements that can solve real problems for real people. That's the really deleterious impact of disinformation. And I guess, inevitably, I have to ask our colleague from Google, what is it that can be done to untie the business model of the digital platforms from the incentives to nurture polarization in our societies? I mean, that's a critical question. I don't have the answer for that, but I hope you do.
I was going to add one thing we have learned through. I mean, we literally work across elections across the globe year over year. So this gets into the dozens and hundreds of elections. And one thing, and this is a good example of it in a way, is this idea of pre-bunking. You don't need to know exactly what issue is going to flare, but to your point, we may know there's an election or there's an issue that is likely or we would be vulnerable to. And to speak to that, and you can think about the right voices, but people are much better prepared when they've heard, let's just say we were saying, Russian influence in Moldova, it may be an issue. They're much more prepared when they hear that in advance of having to respond to it. And this whole idea of pre-bunking is a technique that we as a community can use to help in those instances.
Pascal, do you want to come back, Kevin, on this? Yeah.
And there's another thing that I would add to that, which has been proven to be very important in some of the countries where we work, which is go after the money. Because there are some actors that are spreading disinformation. I can, for example, give you the case of actors in West Africa that are propagating Russian narratives for money. So go after the money. Because in some cases, some of these transnational efforts can be dismantled by going after the money.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, and actually I do want to come to questions. In fact, you know what I'll do? I'll actually go to questions straight away and then perhaps weave in a couple of mine to the panelists. So let's open this up. Yeah, I have a first question here in the front. Could you please introduce yourself?
One. Okay. Yeah, Wojciech Dzingiel-Pulacki Foundation, and it's great discussion. And so I'm very happy to have the Commissioner, Kevin, and Mr. Lamy and Hansen. My question is, for Commissioner. We just finished the Polish presidency, and within the Polish presidency, there was idea, and I think it's still pressed in Brussels, to establish the councils that are on the level of national and European on FIMI. We have one in Poland, and it's working very well with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Something like will be part of the shield and will be joined by the NGOs and so on, and also companies, because we in Poland, we have 25 people advising Minister of Foreign Affairs on FIMI, and it works very well because we are like the NGOs and someone nominated from other sectors. Question is, if there is any idea, and probably you have plenty of proposals, to have something like to engage even this proposal, another one in the shield, to engage NGOs and to build this resilience. So this is the question, what's the idea? And the idea I just put on a table about the one we have in Poland. Thank you.
So engagement of civil society in the defense.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think if we are to protect European democracy, we have to look at what are the foundations of it, because that's where you start. And civil society is at the heart of it, and that's why we will have, at the same time as bringing forward the Democracy Shield, we'll have the first EU-wide civil society strategy. And I'm determined to make sure that it has real substance about amplifying the voice of civil society, about protecting their voice, making sure that the space within which they operate is safeguarded, but also we need to better support them. And that's why we are proposing a new Agora EU programme within the context of the next MFF. But another fundamental part of the foundation of European democracy is a free and independent media. And they are under huge pressure for lots of different reasons. Their commercial model is changing and is being undermined. We see political pressure as well. So the implementation of the European Media Freedom Act is absolutely vital. It has just come into effect to safeguard public service media, to protect editorial independence, to also ensure we have transparency about the allocation of state advertising budgets, which is a critical issue. So when I think about civil society, I think about media, and then we get into the area of FEME and disinformation. And it's in that context that we do need to learn the lessons of best practice around the member states. And there are some very good examples, but we need to build an EU-wide system that will involve pre-bunking and debunking, fact-checking. It will involve the ability to detect really early interference when we see it materializing, and then have a system where we can respond quickly so that people ultimately have access to accurate information when they go to the polls and they're exercising their franchise. And that is fundamentally what the objective is here, because if you look at our digital rule book, DSA and so on, it's not about content moderation. It's not about taking down legal content. It does place obligations on the platforms for sure, including in the context of protecting the integrity of election and addressing and mitigating the systemic risk that may arise from the content online to civic discourse and to electoral integrity. But fundamentally, for me, it is about giving ownership of democracy back to the people, and what we need to do is protect those foundational pillars on which our democracy is built. And I think if we can do that, including through the kind of suggestion that you have made, then I think it will be a good day's work.
Yeah, and I think extremely important to do it, yes, EU-wide, but enlarging EU-wide, and therefore include the candidate countries very much in this exercise. Yeah, the question back there, yeah, you.
Hello. Hello, Shane Gaszewski from the European Union Liaison Office here in Warsaw, but I'm speaking in private capacity. I have one question for Commissioner McGrath and one question for the other panelists, or also for the Commissioner if he likes. You've already stated quite clearly that you will consider a conditionality mechanism and make use of it if needed in the next multi-annual financial framework. I wanted to ask if the Commission has learned anything from the application of the conditionality mechanism to Poland for the payout of the Next Generation EU money, or if the lessons learned are simply it worked, it yielded results, so we will do it in the future too, or if it's more nuanced than that. And the other question is more of a general one, namely, what narrative you as panelists and as experts would say we should employ about Europe in general, because pre-bunking is very nice and disinformation is a problem, but I believe that the people are prone to disinformation because they don't, a lot of them don't believe in democracy and in the European Union anymore. So the European Union is founded on the narrative that together, if we come closer together, we will prevent war amongst each other.
We got it.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
What's our story? Hold your horses. I will collect a couple more and then I'll come back to all of you. There's a question there at the back.
Thank you. My name is Alexander Sawicki. I'm a political scientist, but I'm also affiliated with the Casas-Zamora Foundation as a non-resident research fellow. I have some information for the benefit of the panel and for the rest of the attendees, and that there is a body of scholarship to suggest that we do know how disinformation affects electoral results. You'd be troubled to learn that they tend not to vote at all, and when they do, they pick the most extreme party that endorses their views. This has been echoed in my own research as well. You can do with that information what you want. My question for the panel now is that one of the reasons why coordinated disinformation campaigns are so popular is because they're cost effective. Indeed, if a post or a campaign gets popular enough, it actually becomes a source of revenue for the attackers. How can we affect the cost-benefit analysis
to prevent it being such an attractive strategy.
Thank you. And let me take one last question, preferably from a lady. But I think the problem is I can't quite see. So yeah, please.
Aleksandra Krzysztoszek, Euractiv Poland. And my question will be quite general, and I won't indicate any of the speakers, so anyone who would like may answer. How to tackle the rising polarization among the European societies? As you all remember, the recent presidential elections in Poland exposed that the Polish people, are divided like into two separate camps. But polarization is not just a Polish problem; it is rising in basically most of the European states. And how to tackle the rising divisions in our societies that are becoming, is often turning into hostility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me now turn back to our speakers. I'll go in reverse order. Royal, let me begin with you.
Yeah, I think it's a number of issues there. I think the question, the thing that I think about in the context of our platforms is we too have an incentive for good information to be made available and propagate. So that to be included in those principles of how we do and don't take things down is this idea of promoting good content. That's one of the principles. So I realize there's some art in this, not all science, but that is one of the principles. It's not purely about, is this bad or good? There's quality information that we can promote in addition to what we do to take down.
Pascal?
Yeah, I think, we've heard a lot about systems. Political system, institution, conditionality, digital. I want to reiterate my feeling, my conviction that by experience, what works best at the lowest cost is to equip citizens with the necessary tools and capacities. If I take the example of polarization, in our experience, people who were in total disagreement with sort of preconceived informations and ideas, after 1 or 2 hours of discussing an issue together, come to a much more consensual view, understand much more where they come from. So I'm sorry to insist on this bottom-up approach, because including at EU level, there are lots of things that need to be done. But fostering this, equipping people, trusting people that when they understand, they will behave differently, I think really is the way to go.
Yeah, completely agree. Kevin?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Many things have been said. I'll try to say a word about the question on polarization. This is a hugely important issue. I would say 2 things at a high level of generality. Number one, I would hope that in most countries, politicians come to realize that the kind of problems that we need to solve in most societies require broad-based agreements. And hence, continuing to play the game of polarization, continuing to see the adversary as an enemy, militates against any possibility to solve any kind of important national problem. But not just that, it's also a more fundamental point that forces us to recognize that polarization is the reflection of other centrifugal forces in society. There's a reason why more egalitarian societies tend to do better when it comes to polarization levels, when it comes to fighting disinformation, when it comes to confronting conspiracy theories, because those societies have a glue that binds them together. So polarization is often the reflection, the epiphenomenon of something that is deeper. And it's there where we have to act if we are serious about reducing polarization levels. And let me just say before I yield the floor, I mean, on a couple of points that were mentioned before, to Commissioner McGrath, I encourage you in the process of developing the European Democracy Shield to look outside the EU for good examples as to how to protect democracy. I mean, I can assure you that some of the things that the Brazilians, the Mexicans, the Australians are doing are terrific. And on the point of tipping points, Monsieur Lamy, absolutely agree with you. Just let it be known that we at IDEA publish a report on the global state of democracy based on a mass of empirical experience, and we can be of help to develop in a very concrete way those tipping points. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. And Michael, last word to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nathalie. And I will be brief. And just to respond to Kevin and say that we are looking at best practice globally, and also to say that the enlargement countries will be within the orbit of the Democracy Shield, because they are on the front line of the threats, as we have seen in many instances. I think on the polarisation question, we have to be very respectful to voters, and we have to not assume that people vote a certain way because they are the victims of disinformation. They may well be. We know it's a real threat, and we have to deal with it. But they might just not like the direction of politics or the direction of policies. And I think we do have to do better collectively in European politics at listening and engaging with people in communities throughout the European Union and understanding their concerns and doing our best to respond and adapt to those concerns. On the question that was raised around rule of law conditionality, very briefly, we have learned a lot over the last 5 or 6 years. The toolbox is quite new. The conditionality regulation will remain. It's generally reactive. It's after the damage is done. And that's why we need to have a more flexible tool, and building in the rule of law safeguards into the proposed new national and regional partnership plans gives us that flexibility to step in more quickly and to address issues in a much more nimble fashion so that we can achieve a higher level of rule of law compliance and respect for the Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Thank you so much. I think this has been a really fantastic discussion. The fact that we've really managed to sort of nail down the fact that, yes, there are all sorts of instruments and policies that we can deliver, but at the end of the day, it is about building trust. It is about ensuring that democracy delivers, that is going to ensure that we're going to be able to crack the nut of democratic resilience. Thank you very much. Thank you.